so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here, and yeah, hopefully I won't leave you too depressed on things. Let's go. Okay, so the spirit of this talk today, and I hope it's a talk where I hope that it'll say a few things, and then we'll have a discussion, because I very much hope it's a conversation. But the spirit is that what a government spends, the public pays for. That there's no free lunch. That if the government spends $1, somebody's going to pay. And John Maynard Keynes wrote this in the 1920s, right after the end of World War I, when the great powers were trying to figure out who was ultimately going to pay the bill for the war. And it was going to be, the bill was going to get paid, it was going to get paid by somebody, and it was going to be paid by the public. So I want to think about who's going to pay. If we're going to spend these resources, who pays? And so what I want to do this afternoon, we'll click to the next slide, is basically talk about 4 things, organize this talk. So one is just kind of, let's go back to the basics, to how do we pay for government spending 101? I want to talk about that. Then I want to look at some data. I want to look at spending, taxes, and debt. I want to look at how we've done it in the past and what we're projecting to do in the future. So we're going to look at some past patterns and some looking also into the future. Many people describe our fiscal situation as unsustainable, and I'm not going to argue with that. I'm going to do that, but then if it is unsustainable, what are the potential resolutions? Because at the end of the day, something's going to happen, and how's that going to do it? So I want to talk through sort of the possible resolutions of that. We can think about what we would like and what we think will happen. Those may be 2 different things. And then I'll just finish up with sort of here are 2 things that I'm keeping my eye on, and you may want to too, or maybe not, and that's where we'll finish. Okay, so when the government wants to spend some resources, it needs to buy, it needs to build an aircraft carrier, it needs to build a road, it needs to hire a judge, it's going to need to get resources from John Q. Public. And the way it's going to do that is one of 3 ways. It can either issue taxes, it can issue debt, or it can issue money. And in all 3 of these ways, the government is going to take resources from the public and in exchange hand the public a piece of paper. So in the first piece of paper, it might hand it to be a tax receipt, where it says, we need these resources in order to build an aircraft carrier. We're going to take these resources, we're going to hand you a tax receipt, we're going to say thank you for your prompt payment. You take that piece of paper, you crumple it up and throw it in the trash. It's a worthless piece of paper. The second thing it might do would be to borrow those resources from you and say, we're going to borrow them from you, and we're going to print up a beautiful piece of paper. Beautiful, with lots of fancy engraving, and you're going to take that piece of paper and say, wow, this piece of paper is really valuable. I'm going to go put it in my safety deposit box. Because that's the thing. The third thing it could do would be to print up one of these pieces of paper and go out and buy those resources from you and say, here, I need these funds, I'm going to hand you that. But in all 3 of these ways that the government raises funds, it involves resources coming from the public into the government, and the government hands you a piece of paper. And nowadays, it doesn't even hand you a piece of paper. They're all just various credits on an electronic ledger somewhere. I mean, maybe a few of you carry dollars around, but just in case, but really not. So it's that. So whether the government, taxes you, borrows it from you, or buys it from you, resources go from the public to the government, and paper goes back. And we want to think about what my research and what we do in economics is we think, does it matter which piece of paper the government hands you when it needs resources? Because again, the government's going to spend those resources, and then the question is, does it matter which piece of paper it does? Okay, so let's take a look a little bit at some history. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to plot U.S. federal spending. So this is total federal spending. I'm going to go back all the way to the beginning to 1775, go up to the present, and then we're going to use projections put out by the Congressional Budget Office to go forward up to 2055. So 30 years in advance. I'm going to divide through by GDP. So it's scaled by the size of the economy. So this is, and it's going to be in percent. So it's a percentage of the economy. And I want you to just kind of take a look at we're going to do a little, sort of this time series of government spending as a share of GDP. And just take a look and just kind of identify some patterns. We're going to do some sort of eyeball statistical work here. And so kind of the first things you kind of see is that sort of up until the 1920s, government spending was relatively low. We're averaging well under 5% of GDP. And then it goes up quite a bit between 1920 and after World War II, and now it's about, it's roughly a little bit, last year it was 23.1% of GDP, just about a little over 20% of GDP. And what you see also, what you see are these spikes in government spending that correspond to generally to wars. And one thing that you'll see here is take a look at the Civil War, World War I, and World War II. And what you'll see is as a general pattern is that government spending goes up during the war, which is kind of what you'd expect. And then once the war ends, it comes back down, but it doesn't come back down to its pre-war level. There's a permanent component to these spending surges. So you see it in the Civil War, it goes up, it goes there. You see it in World War I. You see it in World War II as well. And now look at COVID. And what you see is that spending goes up, and then it's come back down, but it's not come back down to its pre-COVID level. So in that way, COVID has been like these previous wars. It's been a lot like the Civil War, World War I, and World War II. That pattern has continued. And if you think about the latest battle about the shutdown, what was the battle about the shutdown over? It was about these temporary subsidies to the Affordable Care Act there were these subsidies that were supposed to be temporary, they were supposed to expire once COVID was over, and now they're sort of, oh, wait a minute, let's make these permanent. So that's kind of making some of these temporary expenditures permanent on that. So you see that. Okay, you with me there? Okay, let's take a look at taxes. So the next slide. Okay, now I'm going to put tax revenue on. And again, I've scaled it by GDP. And now look at the Civil War, World War I, and World War II. And we're going to do a little pattern recognition. So prior to those wars, you see that the blue line, spending and taxes, basically fall right on top of each other. The government's running a balanced budget, where tax revenue and spending are about the same. And then you get a spending surge, and taxes go up during the war, but they don't go up by the full amount. They only go up partially. So clearly we're going to be financing some of those wars with debt and with money. Okay? So we're some mix with, World War I, Civil War was financed, some with tax increases, some by borrowing, some by printing of money. What you'll notice is then after the war, taxes do come down, but note that after the war, taxes, they actually are higher than spending, and the government is running surpluses for periods after the war. Now with World War, I'll just note that after World War II, we'll come back to this in 25 minutes, you can see Korea right there. And Korea's run on a balanced budget. I'll just note that. Korea's financed with a balanced budget, so that breaks that pattern a little bit there. But what's happening is, taxes go up, not by the full amount of the spending, and then after the war, taxes remain higher than spending, and we run some surpluses. Now look at what happens with COVID. So the spending pattern is the same as in the Civil War, World War I, and World War II, but the tax pattern is very different. Here, taxes don't go up at all, and they just don't go up at all. And furthermore, we were running deficits before COVID, and now those deficits are just that much bigger. So if we go to the next slide here with pattern, and if I was really cool, I would have had the actual data here and the pattern here, but hopefully what I kind of convinced you is that with just doing a little bit of pattern recognition, that the basic pattern, if you look at the Civil War, World War I, and World War II, is that government spending goes up during the war, it comes back down after the war, but when it goes up, there's a permanent component to all of those things, and they're higher. Taxes go up partially to cover some of that expenses during the war, and then remains higher, and we run a surplus. COVID breaks that pattern, and we don't have the same pattern as we've done with others, and that is that we were running a deficit before COVID. We didn't raise taxes during COVID. Probably was a bad time to raise taxes. You could kind of argue that when you're trying to tell people to stay home, it's not a great time to raise taxes. But then spending is now permanently higher, and there has been no response to taxes. So we were borrowing before COVID started, and the borrowing's going to accelerate. So, what's this going to lead to let me just see, are people with me there? Kind of buy that argument? Kind of buy that pattern in the data? Happy to look back on it. Okay. So if we then go and look at debt, which would be the next slide. Yeah. Okay. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to plot the U.S. federal debt as a share, and again, I'm going to scale it by GDP. I'm going to look at U.S. history. And what you see is that, during wars, debt goes up because we're not financing those wars solely with taxes, the exception of Korea. And so the debt goes up, but then after the war, that debt to GDP, the debt slowly, as a share of GDP, slowly declines. Some of that is because we are running surpluses, we're taxing more than we're spending. Some of it is coming through GDP growth, just we're sort of growing our way partially out of it. And then some of it is also coming through some inflation on that, which we'll talk about in a minute. With that. So we slowly sort of bringing down the debt to GDP ratio after the Civil War, after World War I, after World War II, the debt to GDP ratio slowly decays. That pattern breaks after COVID. And I'll note, actually, one thing to keep in mind, just to also sort of note, is that the debt to GDP ratio goes up pretty dramatically during COVID. You see the big jump as we financed a fifth of a year's worth of GDP in COVID spending. The debt to GDP ratio jumps during COVID, and that was solely debt financed. It jumps, but actually it goes down for a couple of years after COVID, and we'll talk about that in a second. Just a kind of a bit of a spoiler alert. It's what 10% inflation does for you. We inflated away part of that debt on that. However, when people go off and look in the future and you say, wow, we're going to be, for the next several years, and really for the next 25 years, we're projecting that if the laws as written stay on the books, we're going to be spending about 7% of GDP more than we're raising in taxes every year. Year after year after year. Those deficits are big. Oh, I should have pointed out, sorry, go back, could you go back 2 slides? Let me just note, here I haven't even included, I've taken out interest payments. I took out interest payments because I wanted to argue that this permanent component of spending isn't just the interest payments that we've got to pay on the debt, it's increases in real spending, not just the interest payments. If we include the interest payments, that blue line shifts up as well, and you get really big, again, deficits of about 7% of GDP going forward as far as the eye can see. Okay? And that's going to drive this debt to GDP ratio up to levels that we've never seen before. Okay? Now, when you look at this graph, we say most people, when we look at what's going to happen to the debt to GDP ratio going forward, as it goes there, we say that can't happen. At some point, people are going to bulk. That at some point, bondholders will say, no, we're not buying any more of these things. You want to sell us these bonds? We're not buying on that. And so there's been a view that this debt is unsustainable. Lots of informed people have argued that. I'll flip to the next slide. So this is just one quote from the chairman of the Federal Reserve System, Jerome Powell, and he has said, I mean, there's lots of quotes from him. He says, we've been on an unsustainable fiscal path for a long time, and there's no hiding from it. In the end, we have to face that, and the sooner the better. Okay? Other people have also sort of come in and been concerned about that at some point, what we mean by unsustainable is that at some point, you know, the government goes out and sells these bonds in order to finance our spending, and the bond market balks. The bond vigilantes say, no, we're not buying these things anymore. At some point, we say enough. And if we go to the next slide, I'll just point out that we think about what would happen what would happen if all of a sudden we can't finance government spending with more borrowing. Earlier this year, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was asked this question at a House hearing. And I'll just point out that Scott Bessent's an interesting guy to talk to. One is he started his career working for George Soros, and he was part of the team that broke the Bank of England in the early 90s. So the Bank of England and the British government was making promises that it couldn't keep. George Soros and his team, which Scott Bessent was on, recognized that those were promises they couldn't keep, and took $1 billion from the British taxpayer and transferred it right into their own pockets. So they did quite, that was a team that knows about how to break a government, okay? He was part of that team. He's also the US Treasury Secretary now, so it's his job to sell these bonds. That's he has to auction these bonds off, over and over again. That's part of that's on his job description. He gets asked at a House hearing, gets asked a friendly question, says, how do you explain debts, what it means for debt to be unsustainable? And he says, and will we reach a tipping point? Will we reach a point in which all of a sudden the bond market will balk and not buy these bonds? And he says, a tipping point in debt sustainability is very difficult to pinpoint, but what is not difficult to pinpoint is a trajectory, and the trajectory is unsustainable. And it's what's funny is he pauses, and if you watch it on YouTube, this clip, you can tell that all of a sudden, wait a minute, I'm the guy who's in charge of selling these bonds, and I just said it's unsustainable. So he goes quickly says, when and if markets were to rebel. Put it back off there. It's kind of an interesting YouTube clip. There's this quote about sort of when people get asked, say, well, crises, when will it happen? And the sort of the conventional wisdom about crises and about financial crises and about fiscal crises is that they take longer to develop than you think they should, but the moment they happen faster than you can react. That's the sort of conventional wisdom, and I think it's right. I love this quote from Ernest Hemingway in The Sun Also Rises, where he says, and it's a well-known quote, it says, how did you go bankrupt, Bill? 2 ways, Mike said, gradually and then suddenly. And that's the way crises happen. They happen gradually and then suddenly. Okay, so if we can no longer finance government spending with bonds, if we just can't borrow forever, we're going to have to make some adjustments. And if you look at the mathematics, and this is not fancy theory, this is just simple arithmetic that I'm talking about. There's nothing conservative or liberal or anything about it. This is just arithmetic on this. You see that they basically have 5 choices. And let me just go through these 5 choices. We can reduce government spending. We could increase taxes. We could increase the growth rate of GDP. We could grow our way out of it. We could increase the inflation rate, which is basically turning promises, basically we turn bonds into tax receipts. You say this was a promise, and then you think it's a valuable piece of paper, and then it becomes a... Or we could somehow force federal bondholders to accept losses. Okay, we could do that. Now you can kind of, this is a little bit, I feel like, you kind of have to fill this card out, and it's a little bit like filling out your NCAA March Madness bracket. There's kind of like what you would like to happen, and then what you think is going to happen, and you're always kind of torn by that. But there's kind of, people can differ on both of those on that, but you're going to have to kind of do that. So what I want to do now is I want to think through these 5 options, and just what would it mean for these 5 options to happen. So let me go to the next slide. So let's first talk about federal spending. And let me show a graph of federal spending. So here's U.S. federal spending as a share of GDP. And we're going to go back from 1940 up until 2024, which is when I've got its annual data. And so I've only got annual data through there. And what you see here when you look at it is kind of when you look about what the federal government does, it's often described as a large insurance company with a sideline business in defense. And that's kind of what it is. It really is in the business. What the federal government largely does is write checks. It writes checks for Social Security. It writes checks for Medicare. It writes checks for Medicaid, for SNAP, and for various things. It basically is in the check writing business, and then it has a military. That's what it does. It also writes, interest payments on its debt. That's another form of checks. And what you see is that, like in the 1940s and 50s, the military was a much larger portion of the government, and now it's a much smaller portion of the government. The military is quite a bit small, and most of that of what the government does is Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, veterans benefits, and then programs like SNAP, where it just writes checks, and it writes checks to people. And then there's kind of interest payments, and then there's other is things like the court system and the interstate highway system and all the other stuff. But what you realize is that's kind of small potatoes on there. If you want to cut government spending, you got to slow the amount of checks or diminish the number of checks that are getting written. We'll go one more slide here. I kind of wanted to go forward in time, and here I got data from the Congressional Budget Office on its projections of various spending components. They're a little different than the ones I had in the last graph, and I can't somehow split out defense going forward. But kind of, again, what you want to see here is that when you look at what most federal spending is Medicare, Medicaid, income support is going to be things like SNAP, food stamps, and heating subsidies and things like that. And then you've got Social Security, and then you've got interest payments. And again, these are all just checks that are being written for there. And then you have some other mandatory, these are going to be things like veterans benefits and things. And then there's discretionary spending, which is going to be things like the Park Service, but it's basically largely defense. I was hoping to split defense out on that. So when you think about, well, we could cut spending, it's not going to be, if you want to cut spending, if you want to cut discretionary spending, you're going to have to cut defense, or you're going to have to cut the checks that are going to Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. And that's got to be, or you're going to have to default on your bondholders by cutting your interest payments. And so I'll just say when I give this talk to younger people, to college students, they say, well, the old folks spent all the money, cut them. I'll just say, I did. That's a lot of 20-year-olds think. I'm just saying. I'll just kind of note that. That's good. Okay, let's talk about federal revenue. So we'll go to the next slide. So here, if we look at again federal revenue as a share of GDP, and we look at its totals. Actually, the one thing I'm sort of struck by when I look at this graph is that basically since the 1940s, that the revenue as a share of GDP is pretty stable, right around 18%. Right now it's about like 17.1, but it's pretty stable. It doesn't seem to, it goes up and down, but it's kind of relatively bad. It kind of tells you something about maybe that's kind of the size of government that's kind of sustainable. That's kind of what we can do. Now what you see is that the composition of taxes have changed over time, of tax revenue. So the big tan area is personal taxes, which basically that's your income tax corporate taxes have shrunk. Customs revenue has generally shrunk and that may go up but it's a relatively small share of revenue. And then what's quite big is contributions to social insurance, and those are your payroll taxes to for Social Security, disability insurance, and Medicare, Medicaid, or Medicare. On your pay stub, OASDI. They're getting a larger and larger share, kind of consistent with the idea that basically the federal government is now just a big insurance. It's a big insurance company or a big transfer system there. On that. When I talk to folks in the financial world, what's interesting is I say, this thing's unsustainable. Don't you think it's unsustainable? They say, yeah, we think it's unsustainable. I say, well, how do you think this is going to be resolved? And they say, I say, you know, you're in the bond market. Aren't you going to at some point stop buying? They say, nah, the government's going to increase taxes. It's kind of funny. I mean, I've sort of always sort of taken a little bit back by how they're sort of confident that taxes are going up in 5 or 6 years. They're going to go up. And one story I've heard, which I think is particularly interesting, and I think slightly, I think it's interesting. I think it's worth throwing out there, and I think it's worth keeping an eye on. I'm not entirely sure whether it's going to happen, but I think it's I'm raising my probability that it will happen over time, and I think it's worth mentioning. I think it's a story worth telling, so I'm going to tell you. That's why I'm putting this aside. And that is, here's the logic. Tariffs are with us, okay? So President Trump increased tariffs in his first term, a little bit, and then he lost the election. Biden comes in. Biden doesn't do away with the tariffs. He actually adds to them. So he adds to the tariffs, and then Trump comes in a second time, and he adds even more to tariffs. And there seems to be no political constituency right now to reduce tariffs. In Washington, D.C., people seem to be happy with tariffs. Whether you're both the Republicans and the Democrats, no one seems to be pushing for lower tariffs. Now, as an economist, economists don't like tariffs. And the reason is that they're very inefficient for the level of revenue they raise. They create a lot of distortions in the economy for how much revenue you get. And they say there's more efficient ways to raise revenue. You know, in particular, you know, it's a tax on only 15% of our economy and things like that, and it creates real distortions. Now, so tariffs are inefficient, and my prediction is they'll lead to greater distortions as the years go by, particularly if they're not ruled unconstitutional. I think a lot of firms are waiting to see how the Supreme Court rules on this. They'll create just added distortion. But go back and remember how we got the income tax. How did we get the income tax? Well, back in 1913, people said, oh, there are these tariffs. They're creating all these, it's a very inefficient tax. What we'll do is we'll eliminate tariffs, and in exchange we'll have the income tax. And what we'll do is this will just be a tax on the very rich, and we're going to get rid of tariffs, strongly reduce tariffs, and we're going to get an income tax. And that was the deal. That was the political deal. Get rid of tariffs, add an income tax. Okay? Now, and then the income tax goes where it goes. Okay. This is the prediction of my folks in finances. They say in 5 years there's going to be a clever politician who's going to say tariffs are an inefficient way to raise revenue. A more efficient way to raise revenue would be a broad-based consumption tax, like a value-added tax, like what they have in Europe. Okay? So this is just something to keep it might be what Ted Cruz said in 2016. And he argued for a value-added tax. Okay? So it might come from the Republicans. But it might be sold as a tax cut that says, look, we can give you lower tax rates on a broader base of consumption goods, and this will be a more efficient way to raise revenue. And we won't have to it can start out quite small. But the way it might be done is basically substituting a consumption tax for the tariff, getting rid of the tariffs and getting a broad-based consumption tax, in which case we would have both an income tax and a consumption tax, so we tax you when you earn it and when you spend it. Just kind of pointing that out. I'll just that would be a way of selling a tax increase as a tax cut. That might make it politically feasible rather than just raising rates on income taxes. If you don't think that's that, I'll just say that story's going around. Won't happen this year, won't happen next year, but in 5 years, I think it's somewhat likely that that could happen. So just kind of keep that one there. That's one way we might resolve this. Okay, let's go next. Okay, one thing that you'll see is that here, one thing we could do would be to grow our way out of it. If we all of a sudden had a burst of growth and we just grew, we just get richer and richer and richer, and this debt would become a smaller share of that. And there's a lot of AI optimism right now going on. For artificial intelligence, there's a lot of, if you look at the stock market, 10 AI companies make up a third of the S&P 500. The market is saying we're going to have tremendous growth going forward. I'm skeptical. Okay, I think, and here's a graph. Sort of again, this isn't unique to me. It's a graph. What I've done is I've taken GDP, taken it back to 1800, and I'm going to do it divide through by so it's GDP per person. So I'm going to do it's real GDP. So I'm going to take into account inflation, adjust for inflation, and then I'm going to do it per person, per capita. Okay, so scale it by people. And if you do this, what you see is that it's a remarkably, the United States is a remarkably, it's remarkably linear pattern. It's almost a straight line. This is a really sort of remarkable graph. You see the Great Depression, you see World War II in there, but it's a straight line. That basically, we get richer in real terms per person about 2% every year, and we've been doing this since the 1800s. You want to know why we're a superpower? Because every year, for any 20-year period, per person, we get richer in real terms by about 2%. How do we do it? A lot of the way we do it is through innovation. We mechanized agriculture. We created the internal combustion engine, the personal computer. Every decade or every 20 years, there's a new invention that revolutionizes the economy. And it's life-changing, totally radical. The internet does that, and it keeps us on a 2% path. And to me, AI, it's revolutionary. It's going to be incredibly disruptive. I'm glad I'm going to be retiring in 10 years. I'm like there. It's all that thing. But it's just, to me, it's just this decade's new greatest. And to me, the idea that somehow all of a sudden this line is going to shift up or is going to get a lot steeper, and we're going to have this new era where economic growth is going to be a lot higher than it was before. I don't see how AI is any different than the interstate highway system, any different than the internal combustion engine, the car, the personal computer on that. I don't see that. So I don't think GDP growth is going to save us for that. On that. Okay. Another way we could do it would be through inflation. And that essentially is turning bonds into tax receipts. You say, oh, I'm promising you all of this money into the future, and then what I pay you is actually worth far less than we did before. And so here what I've done is just going to look at World War I, World War II, and COVID. I'm going to look at the consumer price index, and I'm going to normalize the consumer price index to be 0 at the start of each one of those wars. We'll call COVID a war. And then take a look at how prices have risen in percentage terms since the start of the war. So this is the y-axis is the percentage increase in the price of consumer goods since the start of each war. Okay? And what you see is that during World War I, prices went up, and they went up 70%. during World War I. And then after the war, they come back down, but the economy goes into a deep recession, and the government kind of says, uh-oh, we better not, and they kind of stop it. What happens is prices are 55% higher after the war than they were prior to the war. All goods are worth cost 55% on average more after 8 years after World War I than they did prior to World War I. And so you can think about that as basically being a default on government bonds of 55%. That what I promised to pay you is worth 55% less than what I ultimately paid you is worth 55% less than what I ultimately paid you. When you look at World War II, the war breaks out and prices go up, and then you can see the impact of the price controls. So they imposed price controls because they didn't want prices to go up, and they had rationing cards, and they fixed prices, and that puts a stop to the run-up in prices, the inflation, and you can see that flat line here. And then you can see the moment in which they release those price controls. They release the price controls, you get a big burst of inflation, and again, prices are 55% higher 8 years after the start of the war than it was at the beginning of the war. That's a form of a default on that. When I read the New York Times, often the op-ed page often say, we never really paid off our World War II debt. We simply grew our way out of it. And I always want to go, no. Well, what? We inflated our way out of it. We put a little 55% default on things, and that helped a lot. And again, just note, why is it that the debt to GDP ratio didn't go up the last couple of years? Well, inflation. Prices are now 20% higher than they were before COVID started. So we've done a 20%. If we had stayed on a 2%, if the Federal Reserve had honored its sort of 2% inflation target, then prices should have followed that black dotted line. So you can think about that difference between the blue line and the black line as kind of a partial default, implicit default on our debt. And that helped keep the debt to GDP ratio from rising those last couple of years on there. It's been a run. This is a graph I'm going to keep updating. I'll see where this goes on things. I'm there. But you'll notice on that. Now, one thing also is that, again, sort of what's popular among the young crowd these days when I teach 20-year-olds, actually it's a lot less popular than it was a few years ago, was modern monetary theory, which basically said, again, we just simply grew our way out of World War II, we never really paid it off. So actually we did run some surpluses after the war. And you say, well, we inflated our way, that it didn't really matter. And I was kind of, he said, let's say, think about Korea. The Korean War, it was financed on a balanced budget. Why? We'll go to the next slide. So Harry Truman is president of Korea. Now, think about Harry Truman's biography. He was a captain in the army in World War I. And as a captain in the army in World War I, he was told, you should buy Liberty bonds. And so he was a good soldier, and he took his pay from the army and bought Liberty bonds, which he noted after the war were worth far less than he thought they should be worth. And that bothered him and it stuck with him. He never forgot that he felt like he got fleeced in World War I. And then further, and there's also kind of a little bit of also, I'll say that some part of the story is, Korean War breaks out. They call in the big guns from Wall Street, and Wall Street says, we're not financing your war. You guys, we took big losses due to inflation, and we're not buying these bonds again. He doesn't say that, but I mean, there's a little bit of, was it a choice? Was it forced on him? The historians kind of debate that. But I'll note that I really like this quote. I'm an admirer of Truman. I think he was a stand-up guy. You know, he had his faults, definitely had his faults, but you knew where he stood at all times. But you know, in his message to Congress recommending that we tax finance the Korean War, he says the following. He says, during World War II, taxes were not high enough and the government was forced to borrow too much. As a result, when the price controls were taken off after the war, prices skyrocketed and we paid in inflation for our failure to tax enough. The value of people's savings was cut down by the higher prices they had to pay. And I think, he got it. Yeah, I don't disagree with a single word he said there on that. I think that he said it there. Okay. So the question is a little bit like, if we do kind of inflate our way out of it, we kind of default on some of our, you know, implicitly kind of pay people less. Who's paying the bill? And there's a mix of people who own bonds, own these bonds. So I'll just kind of point out that, you know, prior to World War I, it was all domestic private investors. It was all just, there weren't any. Nowadays, the people who own the debt are a mix of four groups. One is the Federal Reserve, which owns about 12% of the debt. That's that big Fed balance sheet they've got. One is government agencies and trust funds. And that is, when you think government agencies and trust funds, it's the Social Security Trust Fund. It's the trust fund that is going to pay for the retirements for the U.S. military and the retirement accounts for U.S. Civil employees on that. Those are the three big funds there. Well, most of it is Social Security, but it's also these two big retirement accounts. And then there's a few other, actually there's 100 other little accounts, but those are the big three. Foreign investors, they have about 25% of the debt. I'll note that when you think about who has the debt, China often comes out, you know, people think about China first. China's actually the third largest holder. The first largest holder, I think right now, it flips around a little bit, I think is Japan. The second is England. Having said that, it's probably money that's funneled through London that owns it. It's probably oil money and money from the stands, and a lot of it's probably Russian things that people are trying to get money out, and they run it. They basically kind of launder it through London. But England's big, and then comes China. There's a lot of thing in the news about how China's reducing its holdings of dollars. People I speak to who know more about it than I do say that that's probably not true, that just China's sort of moving things around to try to make it look like they're holding less, but they really are on that. And then I think the fourth is like the Cayman Islands and things. And again, that's probably not, it's probably not the residents of the Caymans who do that. And then the big chunk is domestic private investors, which is about 40%, and that's you and me and endowments and insurance companies and all that, who own the stuff. That would be who takes the losses there. One thing is we could basically just force federal creditors to take losses. We could just essentially do it more of an explicit default. And I'll say we've done that a couple of times in our history. So one is Alexander Hamilton did it. In 1790, he told the creditors of the American Revolution, he said, we're gonna refinance the debt. You're gonna get new securities. You were originally promised 6% interest. I'm gonna pay you 4% for the next 10 years and 6% after that, and you're gonna be happy to take it. And they were happy to take it because he actually could honor that promise, whereas the previous promises could not be honored. So they were happy, and now he has a musical name on that. I'll also say in 1933, in the midst of a crisis, in the Great Depression, the Congress rewrote the debt to say that we're no longer going to pay in gold. So prior to 1933, Treasury securities paid gold. After 1933, they didn't pay gold. So we rewrote the contracts. And I'll note that earlier this year, there was a proposed, so Stephen Moran, who's now a member of the Federal Reserve Board, had a proposal called the Mar-a-Lago Accord, in which he made a proposal. It died, didn't go anywhere. But part of that proposal was to require certain foreign bondholders to exchange their bonds for new ones. and presumably those bondholders would not be getting better deals. They'd probably be getting worse deals. But that one failed, but I would say it was on the table earlier this year. Okay, so we'll go there. So what's happening right now? So there's kind of two things that I'm looking at, and I'm keeping my eye on, and you might want to or might not, I don't know. So one is, and we've already talked about this, so how much of the temporary COVID spending will become permanent? And I think once the Democrats are the part of the deal on ending that shutdown is that there's going to be a vote on extending these subsidies for the Affordable Care Act, and we'll see how much of that goes through. And whether there's other elements coming that, temporary things that are going to be that are supposed to be phased out, and will they become permanent? Talk about that. The second thing is I think there's definitely a game of chicken going on right now between Congress and the President and the Federal Reserve. And if you guys don't know what a game of chicken is, maybe some of you young, a game of chicken is you've got a car here, you've got a car here, they drive as fast as possible toward each other, and the first one who turns loses. It's the stupidest game on the planet. Okay, but I think there's a game of chicken going on there. So let's go back. So this game of chicken is essentially the Federal Reserve is telling the Fed and the President saying, look, Powell says, look, we're on an unsustainable path. Government spending and taxes are going to have to adjust. We're not going to print money to bail you out. Okay? Congress and the President say, oh no, we're not adjusting government spending and taxes. You're going to have to be you're ultimately going to be forced to print money. And I'll say kind of just how does this play out? If you want to, the technical terms are fiscal dominance versus monetary dominance, but I think of it as a game of chicken. And here's I'll just give you two quotes that kind of illustrate this from earlier in the year on the next slide. So in May 7th, Jerome Powell said, the debt is on an unsustainable path, and it's on Congress to figure out how to get us back on a sustainable path. It's not up to us to give you advice. You guys do it. It's on you. How did the president respond? Well, the president has responded by saying, Jerome, as usual, too late. You've cost the USA a fortune and continue to do so. You should lower the rates a lot. How do you lower rates? Well, you lower interest rates by buying bonds. How do you generate the revenue for buying bonds? You print money. And that changes, it converts bonds, which are one piece of paper, into another piece of paper. That's what monetary policy does, is change the composition of bonds and money on that. Hundreds of billions of dollars being lost, no inflation. I'm not so sure about the no inflation part, but okay. Okay, so I'll stop here. And again, I sort of feel like, ultimately, I think all of us have to kind of fill out this bracket. And it kind of can fill it out kind of two ways. One is kind of what you would like to see happen and what you think will happen. And I can fill it out. I fill it out two different, what I'd like would happen and what I think will happen, I think are two different things. But I think that's, that's why we live in a democracy, is we have different preferences over how we would like to fill this bracket out. So I'll stop there and say thank you so much on that. And happy to